So we look forward to a very interesting conversation. And Patrick, welcome to campus. And Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, though. You can see Patrick and I came out from behind the scrim to make ourselves entirely vulnerable to you. And the last time we got together, I had a maker's mark on the rocks, and he had a draft beer, which was a fine lager. And I regret to say Joe hasn't provided us with the same kind of welcome today, but that's okay. We'll take care of that later, perhaps. I want to read first, and if you don't know this, this is a terrific book, an absolutely terrific book. And I'm going to read a series of adjectives from people who have written about the book. And it says, these are from different reviewers: timely, compelling, unsparing, vividly told, required reading, powerful, eloquent, candid. And my favorite, which is, quote, Hollywood should grab this plot and make sure that Denzel Washington gets the lead role. And I think that's as true as all the rest of this. That refers to a person I would think of as the lead character in this. This has something of the contours of a novel. Orlando Gober, who was the principal of Rice High School in Harlem, where Patrick spent a great deal of time and where he afterwards chronicled a year and much, much more. I want to begin, Patrick, the first sentence of the book. So I'll begin with the first sentence of the book, which is a striking sentence. And it really tells you, to some degree, why Patrick wrote this book. Quote, the most urgent problem in American education today is the high dropout rate and low achievement of inner city minority students. What are the facts on the ground as we know them?
This has been a long-standing problem that public schools tend to look at as insolvable, that poor minority teenagers will perform poorly. To give an example, I always use Detroit as an example of how bad it can get, where African-American males on the NEAP, which is the National Assessment of Education Progress, score around 3% of these students are at achievement levels, at proficiency levels, which gives you an indication of how poorly educated, how poorly served minority students are. And if you look across, the NEAP does looks at 10 major cities, if you ever access that. And the NEAP scores, which are accurate as opposed to state or city scores, they're in the single digits, up in the middle teens. So what you're seeing is the percentage of African American Hispanic students that will become college ready is very, very small. This has been going on for an immensely long period of time. Dropout rates are atrocious. Somewhere around 50% of African American Hispanic students graduate. In the poorer areas, those numbers go down considerably, and boys do much, much worse. And then the same thing repeats at the university. Well, very.
Perhaps we could come to the university later, yeah, because I want to stick with Rice and your project there. Is that fact, that is, that African American or minority students, I should say, do so poorly relative to majority students in high school in this country, and therefore literally set themselves in a circle, yeah, from which they can't escape, a circle of poverty. Right. Is that what brought you to write this book? Was that your motivating, or what did?
Well, yes. I mean, I was struck. I grew up in Canada, and after, I'd lived here a number of years before I started writing about education. But when I did, I started doing articles for the New York Times, and it ended up being in areas like Harlem. And it just struck me, because I didn't go to elementary and secondary school here. On the one hand, these immense number of schools that they're in horrible condition, graffiti all over them, and students are not learning much, dropping out at enormous expense. And then at the same time, you go to a school like Rice down the street, spending several times less per student.
5,000 something, as I recall.
Well, at
the time of the book.
Yeah.
Good.
The tuition.
Differential.
The differential nationally, the differential, well, let's say in New York City you have maybe the average tuition around $5,000 for elementary, around $8,000 for, the average cost around $5,000 and $8,000 for the secondary against, the New York City public schools that spend over $21,000 per student per year.
Okay.
Massive differential in.
And yet, what you saw?
Well, at the Catholic schools, regardless of all the difficulties, the students, the most important fact is that there is order, there is discipline. The students stay, and they get through. They graduate. They pass the Regents exam, which are the state exams in New York, and they graduate and go on to. They all get into college or go into the military. Versus in a neighborhood like Harlem, we're talking about it's mostly African American boys' schools, so maybe 30% of their peers are getting through, and few of them are even taking the SAT or thinking about college. Right. So it's a massive differential, and it always struck me like a CSI scene. You go to the corner, and all these young men are hanging out selling drugs and revolving in and out of jail and shuffling down to the methadone clinic, whatever. But that's their lives coming out of public school versus the young men, absolutely same demographic, wearing their Rice vests, going into Rice, and they're dealing with this every day as an everyday reality, but they're able to to go on to the next level.
Let's talk about Rice a bit. You describe, and there are photographs in the book, by the way, so very good photographs in the book. Which I should have mentioned is entitled The Street Stops Here. We'll talk about that in a second. But tell us about the situation of Rice, founded in the 1930s to serve who?
Mostly Irish, poor Irish Catholic. Rice was always the school with the lowest tuition, sort of in keeping with the Christian Brothers in Ireland, the Irish Christian Brothers, who were founded to serve the very poor. They started 3 schools on 124th Street. Power Memorial, where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar went, that was a little where West Side Story area, and that was eventually shut down. All Hallows, which is in the Bronx and is a more Hispanic school, and Rice, which moved across the street into an old YMCA building. That area of Harlem was Irish, so working class Irish Catholic until the 1960s when it became all African American. So there was a shift over a period of years where if you look at the original photographs, there might be 1 or 2 or 3 black students in the 50s and whatever. There were always some black Catholics. And then as time went on, more blacks, more Hispanics. Became, actually at one point it was a third black, a third Hispanic, and a third white. And then became overwhelmingly African American as that area became overwhelmingly so.
And it's a diocesan school?
No,
it isn't. It's independent.
Well, there's that loose affiliation. I don't think they get
any money from?
Nothing much to speak of, but it's Christian Brothers.
Right.
It
is not, the students there today, you mentioned black Catholics, a few black Catholics. The students there today are not Catholic by and large.
For the most part, when I was there were maybe, 15% Hispanic, most of them would be Catholic.
What's the total number of students?
That year, 330, it's a little less now. Maybe 30 to 40% would be Catholic. But these are all fuzzy numbers because there's such a large percentage of students who are unchurched, so they claim affiliation, but
nobody knows.
Well,
they don't know.
Yeah, so maybe 25% had a Catholic background.
Let's talk a little bit. I want to get into the contours of your story, and as I mentioned earlier, it does read like a novel, and it probably ought to be a movie. I don't know. Perhaps you can tell us if it's been optioned or.
Denzel has a copy. That's all. I have a friend who has a friend who knows his doorman.
Yes. Well, the doorman is the most influential guy around. That's for sure. Yeah.
And he went to Fordham.
I didn't know that, really. In any case, give us the contours of the story briefly for those people in the room who haven't read the book. Let's, by context, you went there in what year?
Well, I went there for the 99-2000 school year. I mean, I was there months before setting it up, and then years after, in the writing process, which is a whole other story. The academic year was 99-2000. Orlando Gober was the principal.
Right.
It became obvious early on that he would be the main character. He was such a powerful, paradoxical, enigmatic, interesting.
Large man.
Fairly large. I mean, he's maybe about 6'1", 6'2", 250 pounds. Not huge, but but his size, his presence was a lot larger than his size.
Right.
And he always commanded attention in a room.
A former Black Panther.
Former Black Panther, turned Catholic school principal.
And turned Catholic.
And he turned Catholic, yeah. He grew up Lutheran. And it's funny, the gentleman wrote that review about Denzel Washington.
Yes, right.
He was Lutheran himself. He says, and that was the most astounding thing to him. He says, Lutherans don't become Catholics. He just couldn't believe that.
Well, you learn something every day, right?
But Orlando was a combination of he was a Missouri Synod, so very conservative Lutheran, very radical politics, and he's the kind of guy that never met a contradiction he didn't like. He that's the way he was, and he embraced all that sort of thing. So he was able to maneuver between very different views of things, but he had this sort of evangelism of a black preacher, the conservatism of his Lutheran background that saw the value in Catholic education, and ultimately the intellectual thirst that led him to Catholicism as a religion. And then the insight that grew over time that really racism is not the predominant issue facing African Americans or Hispanic, but the breakdown of the family and missing fathers. And that was really, the tearing apart of the African American family was by far the larger issue in their lives. He would say, well, there's racism, but it's nowhere near as important.
Now, Orlando was a father figure cubed, I'd say, not squared, cubed.
Absolutely.
And you open the book with this extraordinary discourse he offers at orientation for freshmen, at which he tells them what he's going to demand. Can you describe what the demands were on these students?
Well, be responsible, which might sound, well, of course, but most of these, many of these students are coming out of public schools and public middle schools where the idea of personal responsibility was utterly foreign. They were used to showing up whenever, leaving whenever, behaving in any way they liked short of homicide in the classroom. That was okay. I mean, I asked one student, well, what was it like at your middle school, which is down the street? And he said, it's like this. If you want to talk to your friends across the street, you've got to use your cell phones. Otherwise, it's too noisy. So, the classroom was more like a subway stop, right, and really no sense of discipline and order. And any student, and he was a student who tried to do his work because he was determined but not particularly gifted, and he would really work hard. He had to invent new ways of going home to his housing project every night because his classmates would be waiting for him, beat him up.
Former classmates. And now these young men, and they call themselves men, right?
Yeah.
Rice men.
Oh, yeah.
Were distinguished by the sweaters they wore?
Yes, yeah.
And they dressed in particular.
Well, there was a dress code as opposed to, well, there was a uniform in the sense that they had a rice vest but not a jacket. So there was shirt, tie, the rice vest, neat hair, but they could wear it.
And I was also interesting to note that girls approached them on the subway.
Yeah, that's...
saw these rice men because, could you tell us why?
Well, that year was ranked the #1 basketball high school in the country, and that is, it's often in that league. A number of NBA players have come out of there, despite the fact they really don't have a gym, which is kind of ironic. It's this little partial-sized gym on the 6th floor. They use a city facility. So, which attracts, it certainly attracts a lot of athletes to the school and a lot of people that want to be in that aura. And then the guys kind of learn that if you wear the rice sweater and you're on the subway, you kind of carry that with you. So, girls, especially girls going to Catholic high schools, that would hit on them, I guess.
Is the word. Give them phone numbers.
Yeah.
One of the most extraordinary things Orlando says, which I think sort of encapsulates to some degree the Rice gift and what some would see as the Rice problem, is conform or leave. That was the motto. You did it the way Rice wanted it done, or you we're out. True.
Yeah, many are called, but few are chosen, because few choose. But, I mean, he was very, very definite. You have to make a choice. He was very big about proposing to the students that they are personally responsible for their behavior, 724, 365, and for their academic performance. Teachers are there to teach and to help in any way possible, but they are ultimately responsible. But he also made great pains, because he would go into classrooms all the time and commandeer parts of periods to articulate precisely what he expected, that you passing grade is 70, and what it is to get on the honor roll, and articulate all the components of grading and behavior. So he was constantly teaching the young men as a group and personally how to conform, meaning how to accept the ethos and do one's work and achieve.
It's primarily an ethos of responsibility, as I see it.
Yeah.
For example, he had, what was the gift he gave, or the award he gave for the first person to return something that was lost? There was
Well, it was a Good Finder's Award.
Good Finder's Award, that's it.
Yeah.
So if people were tempted to walk off with a book, a cell phone, an iPod or something, they were rewarded publicly. Their name went up.
Yeah. A lot of positive reinforcement for positive behavior. Also to counterbalance the prestige of the athletes. So he wanted to, he made great efforts to make, getting on the honor roll the coolest thing. He kind of played down the academics and then all kinds of good behavior. There was behavior.
Play down the what? The academics?
No, play down the
athletics.
Athletics.
Okay.
And really play up the the academics and the behavior. He was not all that interested in basketball himself, and it was there, and fine, it did what it did. But the reality is, it wasn't the purpose of an education, and they tried to get it to the students who were athletes to the idea that it's really not, if you're playing basketball, that gets you a college education, and that's the way you think of it. In fact, Andre Barrett, who was the point guard that year, went to Seton Hall, and then he eventually played in the NBA. But Orlando coached him on his college application, and they made a deal with Seton Hall that if Andre stayed 4 years and played, he could at any date later come back and do a graduate degree for free. And that was the deal they made.
Unusual deal. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between Catholic urban schools and public urban schools. You talked a bit earlier about the percent that graduate, particularly of young men, and go on to college. That is the graduation rate, college entry rates. What else? Is there anything else that distinguishes, not that that isn't enough, the two groups of schools, and money, and cost?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was at another Catholic high school. It was in Brooklyn, 850 students, co-ed, almost all African American, tough part of Brooklyn. And I did an informal survey. Why are you here? Not Catholic for the most part. You have to pay. Somebody's working 2 or 3 jobs, or there's some kind of scholarship. It's difficult to be here. Lots of demands, and almost every student, first or second reason, because there is discipline. These are tough kids in tough neighborhoods. They were choosing to be there because of the discipline, because of the order, because of the structure, because of the basic skills, and I think because of the focus on that, what distinguishes two systems more than anything else, especially in the inner cities, because the public school system and from the top on down does not, as an institution and as a system, establish the sort of preconditions to learning. That there is you have to show up on time and behave and be quiet and there's certain things about learning you can't learn if in chaos. So so these preconditions are taken care of at the Catholic school, and then a focus on basics. Kids need to learn to read and write, and often, if you're just still hung up on whole language or whatever, as kids coming from poor backgrounds where they don't come in knowing how to read and write a lot at kindergarten level, some approaches are not going to work very well. So.
There's also a larger, at least I would guess, the workload as you describe it is considerable. These young men do not go home and have a lot of time for playing video games or something else. There are enormous demands on them academically. True?
There's a lot, yeah, there is homework, for sure. You know, Rice was, I mean, you're dealing with, Rice is a school that does the heavy lifting. You know, you're dealing with students from families, 90% single parent families, most of whom, not a lot have graduated from college, certainly very few, if any, have gone to university. So they're not coming out of an academic tradition. So, you know, the school is doing the heavy lifting.
There's a place in the book, won't be able to find it immediately, where there's a young man, I think it's Linwood.
Mm-hmm.
Is that his
Linwood
name?
Sessoms, yeah.
Yes, who was asked, he wrote a completely incoherent paper, but it was long enough, and it had something like sentences in it. And the response of his teacher was to smile, right, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
Compliment him for it, and what happened to this young man, who clearly, this was in his senior year,
Yeah.
as I recall.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, if in all honesty, there are some students at Rice who achieve a fairly high level and even go on to the Ivy Leagues. Most students are not achieving at a high level. The average SAT score that year was, out of 1,600, was under 800. Not high, but they're catching up. Is the best way of putting it. Many of them are coming in at reading at grade 3 and 4 and 5 levels. Linwood was one of those.
Yeah.
So Linwood, his first attempt at the SAT, he got 500 out of 1,600. You get 400 for signing your name.
Right.
You know, and he would be the first to admit he just was not academic. But he learned what the Catholic school, what he did learn was persistence, a work ethic, and failure inspired in him, you know, capacity to work. So he would go back and apply himself and worked really hard, got his SAT up to over 900, and got into Hofstra.
One of the other facets is something you call, and I don't think it's your invention, the common school effect.
Right.
Which I think is Anthony Bragg, who is a graduate of Lynch School of Education, will take credit for some of that, and a very distinguished educational researcher. But something Tony, and tell us what you mean, what Tony means by the common school effect and why that's useful.
Well, it's the idea that, I mean, to me, it rests on the most fundamental claim of Christianity, that all human beings have intrinsic worth, and therefore all deserve an education, regardless of how well they're going to perform. And that, in the common school effect, sort of manifests that in the sense that all students are taught the same, regardless of whether they're ultimately going to get 51 and just get by, or get 99 and get into Yale or Harvard. So there is a commonality of approach. It's not a streaming, you know, and within a context of order and discipline, and basic skills and you know, some strong content. You know, try to give what students need to succeed, and a sense of a bit of a sense of core curriculum, so they have some content as well.
Who staffs Rice?
Who staffs it?
Yeah.
Well, it's owned and run by the Irish Christian Brothers.
But they are not there, except with some rare exceptions.
They've maintained a few brothers there. They try to keep a brother as they have a president principal model, so they try to keep one of the brothers as president, and then there is one brother teaching full-time, another brother teaching part-time and running the office. So
And what kind of lay people, if you will, work at Rice?
A complete range. You know, there are a number of Catholics, but you know, there's a number of non-Catholics. That year, and for a number of years, the dean of discipline was a practicing Muslim who was a great asset to the school. You know.
How is Rice Catholic? How would you define?
How is it Catholic?
How is it?
Well, certainly the values are there. I mean, I suppose, having gone to Catholic school, you walk into Rice, and it's a little bit exotic looking in the sense that everybody's black, and where I went to school in Canada, everybody was whiter than white. But within a few minutes, things are very familiar. It functions like a Catholic school. It looks the same. The students act like Catholic school students. They're boisterous, but they're very respectful. There's a sense of joy and hope and positivity. There's a moral universe there, which I think is really important to a school, because instead of what can I get away with, which is certainly mainstream and street culture, it's what should I do? That starts taking root. A sense of respect, a sense of every individual is valuable, that the norm is treating people properly and helping each other, and that the exception is moral failing. And you know, and the religion classes and the prayer and all these things do affect the students, and they don't fight it. I mean, most of them are coming out of a Baptist tradition, and they're all for a faith-based education. So their parents, they don't have an issue with it. The parents of non-Catholic students will say, you know what, going to a Catholic school actually interests my son more in our religion. So you get more of a, you know, the irony is sometimes the brothers or the Catholic teachers would apologize, kind of be apologetic about a liturgy that's Catholic or whatever, rather than truly realizing that it's fully embraced by the
students.
By the student, yeah.
There's a striking passage in the book that I'm going to ask you to read, and it comes early in the book on page 22, and it's striking in the sense that it told me how tough this place was, how little one was allowed to get away with by way of daydreaming, by way of imagining that there's an easy way out. And it turned Orlando, for me in a particular, I saw him quite differently after this, and you know the passage I mean. He's been talking to you about various, he's just sat on a jury where he helped send a lot of young African-American men to prison for drug dealing. The jury, so it was a grand jury, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that summer he was the foreman of the grand jury. And
series of cases, and as much as he wished these young men were at Rice, they weren't, and they had committed crimes that were detrimental to the community, to say the least. And then this woman comes to visit him. A knock on the office door pulls Orlando back to the present tense. If you could start there.
A knock at the office door pulls Orlando back to the present tense. He rises with noticeable effort, then directs the mother of a prospective sophomore to the couch along the wall opposite his desk. Orlando asks her why she wants her son to attend Rice. The woman responds with a lengthy monologue about violence at public schools. Orlando asks about the young man's grades, to which the mother, apologizing for her son's mediocre performance, blaming it on gang activity. We've been talking for 20 minutes now, Orlando finally says with obvious exasperation, and you haven't asked one question about our academic program. I know safety is an important concern these days, but Rice High School was not built for the sole purpose of protecting your son. Orlando pauses to give the woman a chance to respond, but she's dumbfounded. I'm not going to waste your money, he continues. Clearly Rice is not the right school for your son. You need to get your priorities in order before enrolling him here. The woman's face registers dismay, and she begins to protest. Orlando stands and directs her curtly back to the foyer, then closes the door sharply behind her.
That's tough love.
Yeah.
It's tough something.
Well, it's a combination of things. I mean, he could be immensely compassionate, but also very, very hard. And he would also say, look, in this neighborhood, African-American boys and men, one mistake and you're dead. So there was a sense of you have to get across to students that they have to make choice on this path, and it is a very narrow path. And that to be on it in a half-hearted sort of way, it will not work out. The other part of it was he kind of ran everything as a sort of consequence and counseling mode. That particular point probably wasn't in a very good mood, but I mean, if 1 second late for school, the bell goes off, you get a detention. Don't bring your books to class, you get a detention. So it was a kind of an intense broken windows approach to behavior in school, which focused kids on the little things, and they never did any of the big things, but it also set the stage so that they actually could learn something, because there was, school ran smoothly. And it allowed for the other side to come out, because if a student was acting out, if their student was repeatedly late or anything like that, it always signaled a problem. So if someone was breaking the rules, something's going on. Yeah, and it's often a very, severe sort of thing. Dad got arrested, best friend got shot dead, that sort of thing. So then Orlando or the dean would pull the student aside, find out, and counsel the student how to deal with it. Sometimes an intervention would be needed, but often it's, that's life. You're dealing with a brother getting shot. These things are happening all the time. How do you deal with it, and how? And still, you see, the students, there was always a punishment. There was always a consequence, regardless of why someone did something. Because he was very, very committed to getting the students to understand you have to be completely responsible for your behavior, regardless of circumstances. You're up against a lot in the world, and you just have to perform in the right way. And then, of course, the other side of it was, and the students never complained about that, as long as somebody was listening and helping them get through it. So those two things worked together. There was one guidance counselor per grade, and there's only 330 students. There was a big effort on the school's part to do both.
Can you talk about some of the successes? We talked about one, some of the young men. Now, 90%, is it 90% of those who complete Rice, who go through all 4 years, or is it 3 years?
4 years.
It's all 4 years, go to college or the military?
Well, it's always 99 or 100% of those who stay graduate and get into college.
How many drop out along the way, and where does that happen? Freshman year?
In university?
No, I'm not talking about university. Within Rice?
Well, typically, grades 10 and 11 is where you get the big dropout. Grade 9, high school is this new big deal, and then for them, the distance between the end of grade 9 and end of grade 12 is forever. And they have a lot of time. There's a lot of, well, you'll lose a certain number at the beginning of the 9th grade, because all of a sudden there's rules and there's structure and there's demands, and you have to have your homework in on time, you get 0, and these sorts of things. And coming out of sorts of schools that never demand that, there's rebellion, and some students choose not to, or purposely fail out because they just don't want to buy into it. In the 10th and 11th grade, just the constant adhering to rules and doing homework in an environment where most of their friends are out playing basketball as soon as they get out of school, and nobody brings home books and that sort of thing. So there's always the peer influence.
So, but what percent, if 100 kids say go into?
Oh, well, that varied greatly from year to year. I mean, for over periods of time.
Class, yeah.
They would probably lose anywhere from 1/4 to 40%. But again, it's a transient population too. So families break up, collapse, reform. So you get a certain percentage. They're not dropping out. Yeah. Dad's gone. They got to go over here. A certain percentage can't continue to pay tuition. Occasionally, some will fail out. But
talk about, if you will, some of those, maybe a couple of the students who succeeded and how this happened.
Well, Linwood is a great example because he was not a gifted student. He was. He's not that he is not intelligent. He actually is quite intelligent, but academics he just doesn't. He really had to work hard. And as I say, he got into. This is a young man whose father was arrested between 60 and 70 times as he went through school, in and out of jail.
His father was a drug dealer.
Well, his father was OG,
okay,
original gangster.
Right.
One of. But anyway, he in Orlando, or not Orlando, Linwood took this very, like all the boys. They, when these things happen, they're torn apart and act out in school. I mean, so throughout grade school, at the public school, they're trying to constantly shove him into special ed, put him on Ritalin, all kinds of things. So he had these smarts to want to go to Rice, struggle with the rules, got through, got to Hofstra in a program where they give minority students coming out of neighborhoods like that an extra year. So they'll fund them for 5 years to do 4 years because there's a lot of remedial they still have to do. And he's got that work ethic. And he's a handsome young man, but he went there and he said, you know what, I'm going to work. I'm not going to fool around too much. You know, he did his work. Of course, his mother would have killed him if he didn't, but that's a different story. But he did his work. He graduated, got into a program at Bank of America. He worked several years, and now he's in Atlanta working for Wells Fargo. Owns his own house in Atlanta. But interestingly, now he's not Catholic, and but his tuition was paid for by a student-sponsored partnership, which is a private voucher program. The minute he graduated from university, he signed up as a sponsor to the same program, and started paying for a young man to go through. You know. Yeah. And he formed Harlem Mentors, which is a mentoring thing to help young people in similar circumstances match up with someone like him who grew up in the project. So, and he's doing that with Kawan. And if you read the book, Kawan Williams is another young man, very intelligent but underperformed in high school. And he and Linwood hated each other. Total opposite personalities. Right now, they work together on this mentoring thing. And Kawan, who also is not Catholic, is now an assistant principal at a Catholic elementary school in
Can I ask you
Bronx,
a question that occurred to me 100 times when I read this book? How could you keep from interfering in the trajectory of these young men's lives? Hearing, seeing these things, knowing what you knew, having the resources you had, how could you not begin to act as a player and not an observer?
Well, sometimes you do act as a player. You know, you're a human being, and these are young people, and you know, some people, you know, occasionally you'll kind of say something, you know, like maybe that's not such a good idea hanging out with these gang guys, you know. But you know, for the most part, when you go into a situation like that, people start play for the camera to a certain extent, as you're there as a reporter. But I'm writing a book, not an article next week, and that for them is they just totally lose track of that. It's coming out years later, so they just don't care. So in a sense, their big concern was whether I was really there spying on them for the principal. And when they realized
kind of an expensive way to do that.
Yeah, when they figured that out, then they would pretty well be themselves. I mean, after a while, people just, you know, I think I think to a certain extent, when someone's in the room, there is an influence. You do have an influence, but they tend to do. Over time, I think I thought that students were just more and more natural and honest about issues that they were struggling with and what they were doing. They didn't really hide much.
Clearly, they didn't, judging from some of these.
Well, and I asked after I wrote the book, you know, do you mind all the stuff about your family? And the response I always got was no. That's my story, and from the families too. I mean, I sent everything to Linwood's family and his father, who, you know, was out of jail by that point. No, they want their lives borne witness to, and they're not. It's not about embarrassment. It's about the integrity of their lives and their struggle and trying to help other people.
Sure. I want to give the audience a chance to get in, but I want to go to a couple of things before that. You know, the first study of Catholic schools in this kind of new urban relationship, that is, without the great urban Catholic populations that are now in Newton and Framingham and no longer partaking of the archdiocesan offerings, was by a guy, James Coleman, in 1982. Right. And he said, quote, "The social systems associated with schools matter a great deal for the values and aspirations of students." And that's, to your point, the social systems at Rice were profound in terms of guiding these students. They learned how to work with these social systems, and after that, I won't say things were easy, but once you knew the rules, it was easier to be a learner. Well, the counter response to that has always been, well, public schools have to take everybody, and Rice doesn't. You know, we had that example with that little story. You know, this kid wasn't rejected because he was acting out or something like that. That clearly didn't bother the admissions people at Rice because they brought in a lot of kids who acted out. But it was kind of a, you know, off the cuff kind of rejection, which you can't do in a public school setting. You're an advocate for what Catholic schools can do, or what the Catholic school system can do for inner city, for minority kids in impoverished cities. How do you respond to that? Well, that's easy for you. You take who you want. I have to take every single kid who lives in the district.
Well, public schools do, in a sense, have to take everyone, but they have so much more resources to deal with it. You know, I mean, economists looking at that wait for that sort of thing in their studies, and Derek Neal has done a number of big studies, and still come out with the conclusion that despite these sorts of things, Catholic schools do make a big difference. But public schools, there's a lot of things public schools could do and choose not to deal with this sort of thing. You know, I mean, why are students an issue in the first place? I mean, if you talk to, I recently wrote an article about Catholic schools in Memphis, interviewed a grandmother who had a couple of grandchildren in a Catholic school, and she marched with Martin Luther King and talked about what public schools were like when she went to Memphis public schools. There was order and discipline and very poor environment and real prejudice going on, but those schools function well as public schools. And today, it's an unmitigated disaster. You know, so there are a lot of things that public schools have dropped and could do to deal with the fact that yes, they have to take everybody. It's also true that they don't have to take everybody and put them wherever those kids want to go. I mean, they do have all kinds of alternative schools and whatever to take the worst behaving kids and sort of quarantine them and all these different sorts of things. So I don't really buy that as much of an excuse. They have all kinds of ways they do and could deal with it better.
By the way, I looked at the time on this, not a phone call. I'm not that rude, but it's my watch. One of my sons taught me that. Why do you need a watch? You've got it here. Let me ask you, finally, what is the future you would like to see for Catholic schools? You have done work, consulting work, as well as organizing work, in trying to put together programs that would save these schools. Rice and a lot of other Catholic schools are extremely impoverished. They work on fumes. The president of Rice, we didn't talk about this, but his job was simply to fundraise, so far as I could tell. He was out all the time raising money while Orlando was running the school, pretty much. What is your worst case scenario and what is your best case scenario, and how do you get to the best case scenario for these schools so they can continue to provide this kind of service?
Well, the worst case scenario, of course, is that most of them close, and
they are closing.
They are closing, and
a year or something, I forget.
Well, it was 162 last year. It's been 200 a year since 1965 or something like that. But last year, although it was the same number from the year before, 60%, their loss of students was 60% more. Plus, a lot of schools, like something like 43% are 199 or less, and then so a lot of schools, and 80-some% are under 250, or I forget exactly the numbers. But the point is that they've gone from a healthy enrollment to precarious enrollment in vast numbers, at a time when we're going through this economic crisis. There's issues with donations plus donor fatigue, and then loss of jobs that are for the most part not coming back. So the capacity to pay tuition has declined, and all these sorts of issues. So there could be massive closings in the near future.
You're in favor of vouchers, you know?
Yes and no. It's as an emergency measure, yeah. I mean, I would be in favor of universal vouchers, and there's nothing about publicly funded education that means it has to be publicly run. If the government would just give you a voucher and walk away, great. The only problem is, taking their money means taking their
the rules.
Yeah. What is it? The expression? Shekels come with shackles.
Yes, right.
Right. So, and I've seen that happen in Canada. So. I think any government solution has to be handled very carefully and should always be looked on as temporary.
What's a permanent solution? or
A permanent solution is, I think, a number of things that would revitalize what Catholic schools do, and I think there's ways of sort of upping the academic quality and Catholic identity at these schools, which I think is important. You have to create a new narrative and revitalize what the vision of these schools is. And we should be building schools. I mean, you know, the Catholic population has gone up by 40% as we've lost half the schools. There's an enormous Hispanic population. Few whose children are going to Catholic school. And we really need to be building schools and retooling them for that population. I think the way to go about it is, and there are a number of ways of doing it, all of which can be done. One is to challenge Catholics as a whole to support the schools. Catholics used to give the same as Protestants to the church, and the schools were the biggest expense. Mm-hmm. Now we give half as much, 3 times, 4 times, depending how you calculate. And very small amounts of money add up. There are, you know, about 15 million registered Catholic families. So if you know, you start a few bucks a week, you know, dedicated to the schools.
15 million where?
15 million
okay.
Registered Catholic families.
Okay.
I think it's around somewhere in there. But the point is, so the average family gives $300 a year to the school. Well, most families could double that a lot of families could. I mean, you could double or at least increase by a few $1 billion a year the amount of money that Catholics could donate if it were a focused national campaign for the schools. You could raise hundreds of millions, and you could start upping that with a very, very focused campaign showing the benefits. There's no better bang for the buck philanthropically than Catholic school. It changes people's lives. It's what got us all here. I mean, you know, who was more dysfunctional than the Irish? Well, it's true. You know.
I'll take your word for it, Patrick. I'm not going there.
So, I mean, that's one approach. There are ways of restructuring parish finances. There are all kinds of ways to access different financial structures and sort of reinvent Catholic parishes.
You have been talking to a number of organizations that are interested in this remediation, mm-hmm. in helping to make this possible. People with skills at organization and fundraising, that kind of thing. Have you not?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Are you hopeful?
Cautiously hopeful. I recently got together some folks who had put together a big fund to help, and that had dissipated, and I think they're re-energized again. So, yeah, I think there are solutions. There are many solutions that could be employed. I think the financial resources are there. You know, in the Catholic world, there's a tremendous amount of money, and time and time again, I've had people from the outside, you know, at the Department of Education or city councilors say, "Why can't you get your act together?" You know, they just don't understand why. Mm-hmm. You know, so what we need is leadership. We need initiative. People, you know, universities like Boston College to do what it's doing for K-12. We need more of that, and we need people to step forward and champion programs. We need leadership from the top, if that will ever come. If not, then if the bishop, you know, there is great leadership among some bishops. We need, as a whole, would be certainly needed. But if not, then other organizations, I think, need to become more bold. I mean, the whole thing was built not with money, but the fierce passion and commitment of religious orders and ordinary Catholics who did not have money, but they had the belief and the indomitable will to do it. And I think we need to go back to that sort of attitude and you know, and stabilize things financially, and then appeal to philanthropists for projects on that basis, not to pay off deficits, but
to build.
To build,
right.
And there's all kinds of equity in the Catholic world to leverage for that. So.
Right.